Hello and welcome to Sticky Notes, the classical music podcast. My name is Joshua Weilerstein. I'm a conductor, and I'm the music director designate of the Orchestre National de Lille and the chief conductor of the Aalborg Symphony. This podcast is for anyone who loves classical music, works in the field, or is just getting ready to dive in to this amazing world of incredible music. Before we get started, I want to thank my new Patreon sponsors, Dan, Susan, Roxanne, Simon, and Adrian, and all of my other Patreon sponsors for making Season 10 possible. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. And if you are a fan of the show, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It is greatly appreciated. So I will be heading next week to Lille for the Lille Piano Festival, where I will be conducting 3 different Mozart piano concertos, number 13, number 20, and number 24. I can't really think of a more fun evening than to conduct 3 different Mozart piano concertos with 3 different pianists, Jonathan Fournel, Adam Laloum, and Pierre-Laurent Aimard. I'm really looking forward to seeing the orchestra, also the first time I'm conducting them since being named their next music director. For this week, really hope you enjoy this episode on Schubert's B-flat Sonata. For a long time, I've received emails and messages from people asking, and sometimes demanding, that I explore the solo piano repertoire. Other than a look at the Goldberg variations of Bach, I've basically neglected a huge portion of the repertoire, including some of the greatest works ever written. Why have I been doing this? Well, if I'm totally honest, it's been slightly out of a sense of intimidation. I'm not a pianist, and I've always been in awe of the piano and pianists. So many notes, so much coordination, so much complexity. This feeling of intimidation was so strong that when I started my career as a conductor, the pieces I was the most scared of conducting were piano concertos. Now things are different for me as a conductor, and accompanying piano concertos is one of my favorite parts of being a conductor. But as a podcaster, I still felt that I just simply didn't know the solo piano repertoire well enough to do it justice. Well, now that I've gone through almost all of the symphonic standard repertoire, and now that I've started exploring the string quartet repertoire, I think it's time to throw off this sense of awe and dive right in. You might think I might not reach too high to start off. Maybe an early Beethoven sonata or a Mozart or a Haydn sonata. Well, in my opinion, you gotta go big or go home, so I've decided to explore one of the towering masterpieces of not only the solo piano genre, but of all music, Schubert's Sonata in B-flat. This is a piece that has been described as, quote, well-nigh perfect, as, quote, beyond analysis, as including, quote, the most extraordinary trill in the history of music, and as, quote, the climax and apotheosis of Schubert's instrumental lyricism and his simplicity of form. These are just a few of the superlatives I've found in describing this piece. It was written in the last weeks of Schubert's short life, and it truly does take the listener on an unforgettable journey. There is nothing quite like Schubert's final works, and so over the next 2 episodes, I will take you through this remarkable sonata, a piece that Alex Ross has described as, quote, a premature communication from the beyond. This is a huge piece with so much to talk about, so I've split this episode into 2 parts. This week we'll look at the first movement, and then in 2 weeks we'll cover the final 3 movements. Let's dive right in, coming right up on Sticky Notes. I should mention right up front that the near universal admiration and even worship of Schubert's last 3 piano sonatas is a relatively modern thing. Like much of Schubert's music, his sonatas were forgotten almost immediately after his death. And throughout the 19th century, and even for quite a lot of the 20th century, these sonatas were not thought about very much or played very much. Even Robert Schumann, who was generally much more positive about Schubert than most other critics/composers, said this about the late sonatas, quote, "They ripple along from page to page as if without end, never in doubt as to how to continue, always musical and singable, interrupted here and there by stirrings of some vehemence, which, however, are rapidly stilled." But Johannes Brahms felt very differently about the sonatas and studied and performed them. All the same, it took until the 1930s when performers like Arthur Schnabel began carrying the Schubert sonatas as part of their repertoire. And that's when the Schubert sonatas entered the so-called canon. And it took decades more for them to take their place on the pedestal of being thought of as some of the greatest pieces ever written for the piano. It's an interesting thing to think about when we have all of these inside baseball arguments over what the canon is and whether it should change, because the truth is that the canon changes all the time, and one only needs to look at Schubert's rising and falling reputation throughout history for an example of that. There's one other thing with Schubert that I need to mention before we dive into the sonata, and that is the length of Schubert's works. Part of the reason Schubert's later music wasn't so popular was the length and breadth of his major pieces, most of which lasted well over 40 minutes and often approach an hour in length, depending on the repeats you take, something we'll get into with this sonata. Schumann famously described Schubert's Ninth Symphony, subtitled The Great, as having a, quote, heavenly length. For many people, though, the length was not heavenly at all, and many people have accused Schubert of being overly repetitious with his themes and meandering aimlessly around in different keys. Now, I'm much more with Schumann, considering Schubert's works to be heavenly, and I don't care how long they are, since to me, sitting in Schubert's sound world for an hour sounds like a pretty great use of an hour. But it is a factor in the accessibility of Schubert's music for a first-time listener. So, if you are a first-time listener to Schubert's music and find your mind wandering, that's okay. Schubert's music is very detailed, to be sure, but it is also about the larger picture and the overarching sublimity of his structures rather than every single individual note. This is, as I said, a huge sonata, lasting at least 35 minutes, though sometimes close to an hour, again depending on repeats and tempi. So let's go into it now. The opening of the sonata could be a little postcard of the late Schubert sound. Achingly beautiful, serene with a side of sadness and longing, existing comfortably in the middle register without any sense of extremes, and a theme so simple and natural that it seems to have existed forever. Now, I deliberately stopped there because what comes next is that trill, the one that the legendary pianist Andras Schiff has described as both the most extraordinary and the strangest trill in the history of music. Before this trill, all is well in this moderate yet flowing line of sublime beauty. But then, I watched a video of Andras Schiff giving a lecture recital on this piece in preparation for this show, and at this moment he says, "What the hell is that?" Schiff compares this moment to Schubert's song Am Meer, on the sea, where Schubert sets Heinrich Heine's text that suddenly shifts between a shimmering sea and a surge of water. Schiff says this about this trill, quote, "It's beautiful how often Schubert writes about the sea even though he never saw it. Then the trill, a very distant murmuring, maybe of an approaching storm, still very far, but approaching. It is not a pleasant noise, this murmuring. Maybe it is also the approach of death, and then silence. What other work is so full of silence?" And then the original melody resumes. This is only speculation. I cannot say what it really means. Now, as Schiff said, it's not only the trill that is extraordinary, it's also the silence that comes after. Listen to the whole opening statement, plus the trill and the silence. Since these were the last instrumental pieces that Schubert wrote before his death, this moment and this sonata is often seen as a premonition of death. But since we know so little about Schubert's life, we actually don't know if he knew that he was dying when he wrote this piece. We do know that he was shaken by his diagnosis of syphilis, but there's no evidence that he meant this sonata as a benediction of any kind. There are times where I've thought the trill is just an ornament and perhaps we read too much into it, but then I think better of it. If it was just an ornament, Schubert would have put it in a higher register to make it more part of the gorgeous and serene theme. The low register plus the silence afterwards should give the listener chills right from the start. It's even more extraordinary then that the theme then continues on, as if nothing had happened, as if deliberately ignoring the trill and the silence. Until the trill invades again, but this time Schubert envelops the trill in the gently flowing unfolding of the narrative, and does one of his trademark magical modulations down to G-flat major. Listen to the two chords next to each other, and you'll understand what I mean about a magical modulation. It sounds like the kind of modulation a film composer might use today, but this is the kind of modulation that Schubert uses to lift us off the ground. The theme that follows does really defy analysis beyond just marveling at its beauty. Finally, things begin to heat up, and Schubert returns back to his opening theme in the first loud dynamic that we've heard, nearly 2 minutes into the piece. But it is at the same point that the trill invaded in the first iteration of this theme that Schubert again shifts the harmony and moves to his second theme in F-sharp minor. F-sharp minor is not usually the key a composer would choose for a second theme in a B-flat major piece. The convention is to go to the dominant key, which is F major in this case. So already going to a key a half step up from that is a bit otherworldly, but to add to the destabilization, Schubert also shifts to a minor key. Now, if you're not a musician or someone who cares about music theory and keys, this might seem like gibberish, and believe me, I don't think it's important for you to know exactly how Schubert does this or the exact mechanisms involved, unless you want to, and then by all means, enjoy that. But I do think two things are important to know for everybody. One, that it is unusual in a major key sonata form movement to have a second theme in minor. Why? Because it means something emotionally has happened in the music that marks it as different from other pieces. The emotional state has been destabilized intentionally, and that's perhaps explaining the trill from earlier. The other reason it's important to know about the rules being broken is that these rules exist for a reason. Modulations are conventional in most pieces because over time they have become pleasing to the ear and they become part of the expectations, even unconsciously, that listeners have. In a major key movement, the second theme of the exposition would be in the dominant key, and then in the recapitulation, the second theme is in the home key, emphasizing the dominance, not dominant, the dominance of the home key. In a minor key movement, the second theme would often be in the relative major, a third up from the home key. So by bucking this trend, Schubert is doing something to us emotionally. But it's not that simple. If a composer just randomly broke the rules, the combination of keys can sound jarring and wrong, not emotionally, but logically. So how does Schubert succeed in breaking the rules so masterfully? It's by previewing what he was going to do beforehand. Remember that magical modulation to G flat major? Well, G flat is just F sharp. It's the same pitch. So when we are wrenched into F sharp minor for the second theme, it's not such a shock. Instead, it's just another step in this long journey we are taking together with Schubert. He surprises us, but he also laid the groundwork for it beforehand, so we're ready to continue with him. The second theme features many of the same ideas of the first theme. The accompaniment is simple in triplets which will soon evolve into 16th notes. Schubert also repeats his phrases, emphasizing the ideas again and again. But in contrast to the first theme, this second theme group now builds a tremendous amount of momentum. Remember all the stopping and starting in the first theme? That's a distant memory now, as this F sharp minor theme is quite a bit more agitated and doesn't wait around for us to catch up. Schubert's themes are simple, but they aren't simplistic, and he uses their uncomplicated natures to play around with rhythm in a way that pushes and pulls us through this theme. He gives us long lines, the same line but in dotted rhythms so that the agitation is greatly increased, and then another line in eighth notes, something in between, expansive and passionate at the same time. And then he slows the theme to longer values again, though with trills added. Are we supposed to remember the trill from the beginning here? I'm not sure, but what Schubert has done with all this toing and froing is that he has found himself in F major, which happens to be where we belonged this whole time. The F sharp minor agitation was an extra hurdle to climb to get us to where we needed to be. But once we're there, we have the most uncomplicated music yet, a theme in triplets that could have come straight from a Mozart sonata. But now things start to get very strange and, frankly, a bit unsettling. Listen to the next passage, which marks the coda of the exposition, and try to count how many times the music stops and we hear silence. I counted 12 stops and starts, which in a minute or so of music is an immense amount. Every time we seem to be getting somewhere, the motion stops, as if we have lost our train of thought, or we've been distracted by something, or. This amount of silence is unnerving, and it brings us to one of the big debates in this sonata. We're about 4.5 minutes into this movement, and at this point, Schubert tells the pianist to repeat the entire exposition. Schubert already has the reputation among some of being a bit long-winded, so many performers choose to skip exposition repeats in Schubert's bigger works because it's an easy way to shave off a bit of that repetition. I've done it myself in his Ninth Symphony, and when I played the cello quintet, I remember big debates about that first repeat in our group. It's a relatively uncomplicated decision when the repeats are carbon copies, but sometimes composers would write somewhat extended connecting passages back to the beginning, music that you will not hear if you don't take the repeat. The best example I know of this is in Mendelssohn's String Octet, where the first ending is one of the most thrilling moments of the entire piece. If you don't take the repeat, you don't hear that moment. Well, in the Schubert B-flat, it's an even more glaring example. Listen to the end of the exposition and the beginning of the development without the repeat. It's incredibly beautiful and a bit unsettling. But now listen to the music that falls in that repeat sign. I'll let Stephen Huff, another legendary pianist, explain why he thinks that doing this repeat is necessary, and I'm pretty sure, despite my slight impatience with repeats in general, that I agree with him. Quote, "This movement's 9 first-time bars have been the subject of a certain controversy for 2 reasons. First, because of their strange dislocated character, and secondly, because they force the pianist to repeat the movement's exposition. Hence, they have often been omitted. I feel that they are important, not only because that same genius who wrote the rest of the work also wrote these bars, but also because their radical nature should alert us to a hidden message beyond the obvious. This weird, stuttering, hesitating passage has an important psychological significance in the structure of the movement. It emphasizes the fact that even in the most lyrical moments there lies disquiet. It contains the only example of the shuddering bass trill played fortissimo, a terrifying glance of recognition. It is a premonition of drama to come in the development section, and it enables both the return of the opening bars and the C-sharp minor second-time bar to have a greater magical effect. The other objection, that repeats for Schubert were a convention he was unable to shake off, and that to hear the exposition once is enough, doesn't convince me. These 9 bars are as far from convention as is possible, and a repeat is never a duplicate. It is ultimately a matter of patience, with the music, with oneself, of allowing something time to unfold and to grow." With all that in mind, now listen to those first-time bars. Now how about that C-sharp minor second time bar? It definitely means more after we have now heard nearly 9 minutes of music. And now we hear something new. The beginning of the development, which we now know, thanks to the first time bars, and also this surprising modulation, will be anything but conventional. Schubert begins the development in C-sharp minor with the opening theme, but obviously, being in a minor key, it takes on a completely different emotional character. It's now brooding, not serene. It also immediately becomes harmonically unstable. The first theme was almost radical in itself in its insistence on staying home in B flat. But now in the development, the harmony is changing constantly. Now Schubert begins a series of sequences based on the triplets from the third theme. A development is supposed to wander, and wander we do, through thickets of notes in different keys, never quite sure where we are going to land next. We then arrive at a sublime moment in D-flat major, where we hear what seems like a new theme. But it's only a new theme if we haven't heard that first ending. Remember those strange, hesitant notes? Now they have come back as comforting appoggiaturas or sighs. But all the time, the low D-flat rumbles, a reminder of that premonition, the trill from the beginning. Schubert's music is always looking back on itself, even when it looks forward. And then one of the fundamental battles of the movement breaks out. We have heard a theme resolutely in two, along with a theme resolutely in triplets. Now the two come together in a battle for supremacy that seems to break the music apart entirely. We are left with a D minor chord that hovers in the air. There are moments where Schubert's use of the chord doesn't even sound like D minor anymore, though. It has a numinous, almost vague quality to it, a trick that I can't figure out how he does. However he does it, we are in limbo, as if between life and death. And did you hear that? It's the trill returning. Yet another goosebump-inducing moment that means even more because of that one terrifying fortissimo in the first ending bars. What comes next is hard to describe. I'll explain what happens in a practical way first, but then you just need to listen, as it is on my Mount Rushmore of extraordinary transitions. Schubert starts to bring back his main theme, but first in D minor. Then that scary trill actually serves as a guide home, as Schubert gives us a glimpse, almost from beyond the veil, of B-flat major, of home, telling the pianist to play as softly as possible. We return back to D minor, and then things stop again. The relentless motion of the development evaporates, and with a series of modulations, everything begins to fall away until we are left only with the trill and silence, and another trill and silence, followed by the beginning of the recapitulation. That's the best I can do to give you the roadmap of this movement. Now listen and just marvel at this music. The recapitulation is much the same as the exposition, except there are still some strange outliers. That second theme is now in B minor, even more weird in a B-flat major movement than the F-sharp minor version was. But in the end, we do get back to B-flat for the third theme as we're supposed to. But the transition to the coda is again full of those strange stops and starts. This isn't a gentle unwrapping like the transition to the recap. It's halting, uncomfortable, and unsettling. No one manages to calm and to disturb like Schubert, and he sometimes does both at the same time. movement that can be nearly 20 minutes long with the repeat taken seems to demand a long coda. But in Schubert's case, the story has been told, and there is no moral to it. One more iteration in the beginning of the theme, one more trill, and the book is closed. It's a surprisingly modest and unresolved ending, despite its calm and gentle nature. Let's look back at this remarkable journey Schubert has taken us on. We have traveled through serenity, through premonitions of doom, of agitation, of hesitation and doubt, of loss, of being found again, and finally of a kind of bittersweet resolution. Not bad for 20 minutes of music. Schubert's gifts are something to marvel at over and over again, and if you're not familiar with the rest of the piece, just wait for the movements to come in a couple of weeks. Prepare to be amazed, heartbroken, and fulfilled, again, often all at the same time. But for that, you'll have to wait for 2 weeks from now. Thanks so much for listening to Sticky Notes today. We'll have some more exciting stuff for you in 2 weeks, so don't miss our next episode. If you like what you heard today, please feel free to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show gain more visibility. Please send any questions to stickynotespodcast@gmail.com or my Facebook page @StickyNotesPodcast. And if you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, just head over to patreon.com/StickyNotesPodcast. Thanks, and I'll talk to you again after a while.